I wonder whether what your thoughts are on the fact that a couple of days ago the Russian ambassador to the UK told us that we are now directly involved in the Ukraine war. We also have a big issue I want to talk to you about in a second about the International Criminal Court. But in regard to Ukraine, first of all, where do you think Britain stands in this? How much risk do you think there is?
Well, good morning, and good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
I think the bottom line is that we are not at risk of nuclear attack. I think we can still sleep quiet in our beds, even though the only thing, in my judgment, that the Starmer government has done right in foreign policy during its rather extraordinary first period in office has been to stand firm with making sure that Ukraine is still in the game. But the reason that we still have adequate deterrence is nothing to do with us, Peter. It's because the Americans are still the backbone of NATO, and come January, they are about to acquire a formidable new commander-in-chief who scares the living daylights because he's so unpredictable. He's like Richard Nixon, Mr. Trump. You never know what he's going to say next, and that is a very good quality to have if you're an American president. It makes people careful.
And there can be no whitewash at the White House when it comes to Donald Trump's opinions on Ukraine. Really, really interesting one, and he would, of course, also say that he is not a crook. I wonder, when it comes to the ICC as well, that Trump is now saying that he could sanction the British lawyer, the head of the International Criminal Court, who's pushing for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Well, I think that that's an excellent move to make, quite frankly. The International Criminal Court is one of these organizations that started off as a noble idea with the Rome Statute. It was supposed to be a special court for very special events, like when people have actually committed genocide, as happened in Bosnia. Genocide, remember, is a term that was invented for a very particular action in history, which was the Nazi killing of all the Jews in the concentration camps. And to have this court accusing the Israeli Prime Minister of genocide is frankly grotesque. And furthermore, it's a libel, because if, as I do, you study quite carefully the technical parts of the war that Israel has been compelled to fight since the pogrom of the 7th of October, when Hamas terrorists, you remember, stormed in and murdered and butchered and raped all those people in southern Israel.
Horrendous. Yeah.
But let's just deal with some figures. When Israel went back to deal with Hamas, there is, in military parlance, a thing called the KR, which is the kill ratio. Not a nice statistic, but a necessary one. How many civilians die for each combatant? Well, we now know the figures for the Israeli operations in Gaza, and they are between 1.1 to 1 and 1.68 to 1. Now, put that into comparison with the British Army or the American Army in Iraq or Afghanistan, where it was about 3 to 1. And the UN average for all wars since the end of the Second World War is 9 to 1. So what am I saying? This is absolutely topsy-turvy. The Israeli Defense Force is actually the most life-sparing armed forces who've been in operation since the end of the Second World War. And to accuse them of genocide is, frankly, a libel.
Well, we know why that word is used, don't we, Gwithian? We know why that word is used, because it is an echo of an actual genocide, which you, of course, referred to earlier on, what the Nazis did in the Holocaust.
Is what makes it so peculiarly offensive, Peter.
Yeah. And a genocide, I mean, the genocides that I was actually reading about this earlier, because someone was accusing me of Twitter of using the language incorrectly, but I was using it correctly, as you just have. It's in regard to the Holocaust, what happened at Srebrenica, Rwanda, Cambodia. Those are the 4 that have been deemed genocide. People are using these words. They use words like war criminal as well to describe Benjamin Netanyahu. I understand why they're doing that, but can you just tell us, in your view, that you do not think that Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal because of this?
I want to add to your list, because if you read the Hamas charter, for example, or you look at the underlying documents of Hezbollah, the 2 proxies of Iran, and if you look at the statements of the Shia theocracy in Iran, their views about Israel and Jews are, and I use the word directly, genocidal. The Arabs have been offered land for peace 6 times since 1922. Each time they've refused. And in 1973, Golda Meir, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel, said, they want us all dead and we want to stay alive. And between these two positions, there really is no negotiation, which is pretty obvious. So it is factually the case that these organizations, particularly Hamas, which is a direct descendant from Nazi genocidal belief against the Jews. It goes through al-Hussein al-Khomeini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who lived throughout the Second World War in Berlin and was a voice piece for the Nazi regime. It's a direct line. These people are the closest thing we have to the Nazis still operating around in the world. And so it is extraordinary. And frankly, for our Prime Minister, who is supposed to be a lawyer of some sort, to weekly collapse on this. You know, the International Criminal Court has made a disgrace of itself. The Israelis don't recognize it. The United States doesn't recognize it. Frankly, I think we should now not recognize it either. Its claim is that all the states of the world agreed that there should be a special court for genocide. It has misused its mandate. And it cannot, in any case, impose its law on the sovereign law of a free and sovereign country like this one, unless we agree for it to do so, and we should not.
The chief law officer, Gwithian, the chief law officer of this country, certainly from a governmental perspective, the Attorney General, is Richard Hermer. I wonder how much you're aware of him, because
I'm very aware of him.
Yeah, I mean, he is someone who has expressed very pro-Palestinian views on many occasions previously. I wonder whether you believe Kier Starmer's legal thinking around this will have been influenced by that aspect of things.
Well, Peter, I'm going to leave aside the question of whether or not he has expressed pro-Palestinian views. There is a more fundamental legal issue, and it's this. Mr. Starmer is a human rights lawyer. Mr. Hermer is a human rights lawyer. They all come from the same stable, you know, from Doughty Street Chambers and from Matrix Chambers. And these people hold a view which I believe to be fundamentally false, which is that what they call international law is not law. And the reason I say that is that to be law, you have to be able to have a tribunal in which you bring whoever it is you're accusing before a court. And then you have to have a means of either giving satisfaction or punishment. And you cannot do this for sovereign states. So therefore, what we have, again, another great idea which has been hijacked. We had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights drawn up in the aftermath of the horrors of the true genocide against the Jews in the Second World War. And then it was turned into this thing which they call international law. Remember, it's in play all the time in Mr. Starmer's mind, because that's what he has been throughout his career. And it's on that basis that the completely specious claim that the United Kingdom should give up its sovereignty over the absolutely fundamentally strategically important Diego Garcia base in the Chagos Islands, that is based in the claim that an opinion of the International Court of Justice, which is a UN body, is somehow law. It's not law. These are performative acts. And we need to be very, very much more severe with these people. We have a government that is run by human rights lawyers, and human rights law is, in my view, not law.
Thank you. That's Gwithian Prince there, Professor Gwithian Prince, who's a former NATO advisor. He's a member, was a member of the Chief of Defence Staff Strategy Advisory Panel. First time we've had him on the programme. It will not be the last, let me tell you. What interesting thoughts he had there. What do you think? Has Kier Starmer brought us closer to World War III? What do you think about his views versus Donald Trump's views on the indictment or the arrest warrants going out in regard to Benjamin Netanyahu? Let's talk to Mary Dejevsky, a columnist and former correspondent in Moscow, another great thinker on international affairs. Mary, I wonder how much you heard of what Gwithian was saying there. In terms of the International Criminal Court itself, I mean, from the UK's point of view, what is your view of how Starmer has handled this?
Well, yes, I did hear most of what Gwydion Prince said, and I have to say that I agree with quite a lot of what he said. One of the most striking things that happened to me very early in my career was that I wrote an editorial for the Times about which mentioned international law, and I had a whole essay sent to me by a very eminent legal practitioner in London explaining why this was totally wrong, and as Gwydion was setting out, why the whole concept of international law was highly questionable. So that has left its mark, as it were. I think it's very interesting that we've got the Prime Minister, Kier Starmer, who is, as was said, an international human rights lawyer, and he has set himself at odds with the United States, very early in his prime ministership and towards the end of the Biden presidency, but also anticipating the presidency of Donald Trump. And it looks as though in this particular issue of Benjamin Netanyahu being subject to an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, that the British are taking one line and the Americans under this president and the next one are going to take a very strong opposite line. But I have to say that on the one hand, yes, this looks like a complete schism, and these two countries, close allies, taking absolutely opposite views. But I also have to say that the actual meaning of this, the actual significance of this, is maybe not quite as great as it looks. Kier Starmer has a particular, and his government have a particular interest in supporting these arrest warrants. The Americans, who, as was also pointed out, do not recognize the International Criminal Court. They're not part of this procedure. So that as long as Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister don't go traveling in which recognise that.
And I wonder, Mary, sorry to interrupt you, I wonder about this idea of a sanction for the head of the ICC and how that could actually work from Donald Trump. I mean, if it's a court that you don't actually recognise, well, how can you sanction the head of it, for example? I mean, what's the actual practicality of that necessarily?
Yes, well, I think this is a prime weakness, really, because if you're not part of the process, what right do you have to sanction the head of the criminal court, or indeed anyone involved in that? So I think we await, but there is an awful lot of words spent on International Criminal Court, arrest warrants and whatever, which very, very rarely is translated into action. Yeah,
it's very true. It's very true. Mary, thank you. A shorter chat today, but thank you very much indeed. That's Mary Dejevsky, who's a columnist and former correspondent in Moscow.